Hello everybody, I'm Thrash Maniac HD, and I bet you're wondering, holy crap, this is a long video. Well, sit back, get yourself a drink and a snack and enjoy. This is the definitive list, for me, of the top 100 greatest hard rock heavy metal albums of the 1980s. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get to the list, so that way I don't spend my whole night talking about it. Starting off at number 100, we have, from 1989, Terrorizer's World Downfall. Wow, talk about tremendous grindcore. Terrorizer, when they came out with this album in '89, this was such a brutal turn for American extreme metal, because in Europe you had the grindcore stuff, in Florida you had the birth of death metal. This band came from Florida, and they mixed both sounds of death metal and grindcore to produce this album. And on this album you had Pete Sandoval and David Vincent, who would be in Morbid Angel, and Jesse Pintado, who would play in Napalm Death. And just this album was tremendous. Fast, heavy, brutal, short songs, and very political. Number 99, Judas Priest, Defenders of the Faith from 1984. I thought this was a really good release for Priest, following up Screaming for Vengeance. Didn't think it was as good as some of their stuff that came out before this, but this was still a really good album. Free Will Burning is a classic song by Priest, so based on that song alone, this album made the top 100. Number 98, Van Halen, from their album 1982, Diver Down by Van Halen. Mostly covers, but it was a really good covers album nonetheless. They did a good job doing the cover of Roy Orbison's Pretty Woman on here. I like this album. I also like the song Little Guitars and Happy Trails, some good stuff on here. I really like this album. Number 97, we've got from 1987, Ignorance by Sacred Reich. You want to hear some good political thrash metal, this is the band for you. Sacred Reich was one of those thrash bands that talked a lot about social issues, about people going to war, and thoughts on war in general, and politics in general. If you want to hear political, fast, heavy metal, Sacred Reich is one of the bands for that. And that album, Ignorance, was a tremendous masterpiece. Number 96, from 1988, Eternal Nightmare by Violence. Brutal thrash metal with a violent kick. I mean, when you got songs like Eternal Nightmare, Kill on Command, and Bodies on Bodies, you're definitely expecting some very fast, brutal metal. Number 95, from 1987, we've got The Ultraviolence by Death Angel. Now, this is thrash metal with a melodic kick into it, because thrash metal, for the most part, has been not too melodic. Death Angel was a band that brought a little bit of a progressive, melodic feel to thrash metal music, and this album definitely proved it. Number 94, from 1980, also the very first album in music in general to come out in the 80s, January 1st, 1980, Permanent Waves by Rush. Great progressive rock with some classic rock elements, hard rock, and a little bit of metal involved. Rush is the band where you want to hear some great musicianship and great songs. And this album, with songs like Spirit of Radio and Jacob's Ladder, Entre Nous, you're expecting some great music. Number 93, from 1988, Reek of Putrefaction by Carcass. I put this album on the list because, this album, sound-wise, was pretty crappy, because the production wasn't that great, but I kind of like it for that reason, because it's just so nasty, noisy sounding. And this was their shortest album. It was like a 30-minute album with 22 songs. This was when Carcass was grindcore, supposedly, even though I don't hear any grindcore in this album whatsoever. And this album had some pretty brutal lyrics, just like any other Carcass album. Number 92 from 1989, the album Horrified by Repulsion, one of the progenitors of grindcore, death grind, death metal, whatever you want to call it. This album was under 30 minutes with about 18, 19 songs, and brutal, fast, aggressive, in-your-face, gory lyrics. Just absolutely an underrated album. It should get some more appreciation among rock metal fans. Number 91 from 1984, we've got Hail to England by Manowar. You want to hear some really good power metal? Manowar is one of the bands for that. They're arguably one of the first power metal bands to come out in America. And this album was a groundbreaking release for that whole genre. Alright. Excuse me. Number 90, we've got Another Perfect Day by Motorhead, which came out in 1983. This was the only album to feature former Thin Lizzy guitarist Brian Robertson. I thought this was a great album. I mean, definitely had speed metal influence, heavy metal. I love the song Shine. That's like, because it's got one of my favorite guitar riffs in it. If you want to hear that riff, check out the song. Number 89 from 1984, it's an EP, but the Haunting the Chapel EP by Slayer. 4 songs, intense, brutal thrash metal from probably arguably the most extreme metal band of all time, arguably. Number 88, another EP which came out in 1984, Apocalyptic Raids by Hellhammer. Hellhammer's one of those bands that gets kind of categorized as part of black metal or death metal. To me, this was just a very, very evil, brutal thrash album, just like a Slayer album, basically. It just happened to influence death metal and black metal and extreme metal music in general. This is the only real big release from Hellhammer, as to after this EP came out, they split up and formed Celtic Frost, and I'll get to some of their material later in the list. But number 87 we've got from 1983, we've got Bark at the Moon by Ozzy Osbourne's solo band. The first album without Randy Rhoads on guitar. They got Jakey Lee on this release, as well as their next album, The Ultimate Sin, which came out in 86, although I don't have it on the list. But Bark at the Moon was a great album. I love the song Bark at the Moon. Great stuff. And hail Jakey Lee for doing a great job. Number 86 from 1981, we've got the Van Halen album Fair Warning. This has got some good stuff in it as well. The song Unchained, one of the band's most popular songs. You've got other songs like Mean Street, a bunch of other greats. Number 85 from 1986, we've got Beyond the Gates by Possessed. Their follow-up to their album Seven Churches, which I'll talk about later in the list. Beyond the Gates was a different sound than Seven Churches. It had a more progressive thrash feel with the grunty vocals. But I think Beyond the Gates is a highly underappreciated heavy metal album. It came out Halloween Day 1986, and it fit Halloween perfect. Number 84, which came out in 1986, Darkness Descends by Dark Angel. Fast, brutal, progressive thrash metal. Gene Hoglan's drumming on this album is absolutely insane. Just everything about this album, production, sound, playing, musicianship, everything about it was fantastic. Number 83, which came out in 1984, The Last in Line by Dio. Rest in peace, Ronnie James Dio. This was another really good release from Dio. This is only Dio's second solo album. His first one I'll get to later in the list, but Last in Line was a great follow-up to Holy Diver. I just loved it. Alright, number 82, we've got from 1987, Girls, Girls, Girls by Motley Crue. This is a great glam hair metal album, if you want to call it that. I thought this was great for that kind of hard rock, heavy metal music. Motley Crue was always probably my favorite of the glam bands. But Girls, Girls, Girls was a really good release. Number 81, which came out in 1989, Practice What You Preach by Testament. Testament has always been one of my favorite bands of all time because they just have great musicianship, great songs. Very fast band, a thrash band, but have some melodic elements in it, some technical elements from Alex Skolnick on guitar. And Practice What You Preach was no different than any other Testament album that came out in the 80s. It was just great in-your-face thrash. Number 80, which came out in 1981, Point of Entry by Judas Priest. This was one of their not-so-heavy albums. This was still heavy, but it was more towards traditional heavy metal and hard rock. But there's some good, catchy tunes on here, like Heading Out to the Highway and Hot Rockin' and Don't Go and a bunch of other good songs. And there you go. Number 79, which came out in 1981, is Moving Pictures by Rush. This album was better, in my opinion, than Permanent Waves, and also when you got the classic song Tom Sawyer on here, and even good stuff like Limelight and YYZ, just great over-the-top songs, great structures. Rush has always been one of my favorite bands as far as musicianship, because they can play their instruments really well. I mean, Neil Peart, the greatest drummer to ever live. Alright, number 78, which came out in 1987, Hall of the Mountain King by Savatage. One of the best traditional heavy metal / power metal / progressive metal bands to come out of America. And this had some really epic qualities to it, and the song Hall of the Mountain King really gets me going. Number 77 from 1988, we've got So Far, So Good, So What by Megadeth. Probably one of their most overlooked albums in the entire discography of Megadeth's career. I thought this album had some really good stuff in it, like the song In My Darkest Hour, their cover of Anarchy in the UK, the instrumental Into the Lungs of Hell, Hook and Mouth, Set the World Afire, bunch of other good ones. Number 76 from 1983, Show No Mercy by Slayer, the first album to come out from Slayer. I thought this was a great album, a little bit underrated in my opinion. And this was their only album that was in standard guitar tuning, which made it even more cool for me because I like standard tuning heavy metal music because it just sounds so good. Alright, number 75, we've got from 1987, Join the Army by Suicidal Tendencies. Suicidal Tendencies has always been one of those bands that have really intrigued me because of how they mix in a lot of different types of music. Like, they mix in hardcore, metal, thrash, funk metal, or whatever, funk music. This was the album where they combined hardcore and thrash together in order to create the metal movement known as crossover, where hardcore bands who loved metal would go into the metal direction, and so on and so forth. This was one of those first cases. Number 74, which came out in 1988, we've got The New Order by Testament, the second Testament album to ever come out, and this was a phenomenal album. Continuation from the first album, The Legacy, which I'll talk about later, but The New Order had some great songs in it. Loved it, loved it, loved it. Number 73, we've got from 1985, Theater of Pain by Motley Crue. This was the first step for Motley becoming more of a glam band, because most of the songs on this album were about love and sex and whatever. I actually really did like this album. I particularly love the songs Home Sweet Home and their cover of Smokin' in the Boys' Room. Great songs. Number 72, which came out in 1986, Morbid Visions by Sepultura, the first album from Sepultura, and this was more of a death metal album than their later work. I think this is really their only real death metal, black metal, thrash metal sounding album they had, because really the albums that came out afterwards were straightforward thrash, and then they evolved into different sounds later in their careers, beginning in the mid-90s. But Morbid Visions was a pretty poor produced album, but it was a heavy album, a great album nonetheless. Number 71, which came out in 1980, Women and Children First by Van Halen. Another great release that came out in the 80s from Van Halen. I loved the songs In the Cradle Will Rock and Romeo Delight. Great heavy stuff. Awesome. Number 70, which came out in 1989, Symphonies of Sickness by Carcass. The second album to ever come out from Carcass, and this album was a huge improvement musicianship and production-wise, because the songs were longer. This was actually about a 50-minute long album, because it was 10 songs, long songs, and they played better, it sounded better. Everything about this album is phenomenal. Symphonies of Sickness was a great Carcass album. And it began the run Carcass would have for the next about 5 years, where they were really getting big on tours and stuff. Number 69 from 1986, we got Epicus Domuscus Metallicus from Candlemass. This was a very big key release in the development of the doom metal subgenre of heavy metal, which that style came from Black Sabbath from their early albums. So these bands like Candlemass and Cathedral and Pentagram and The Obsessed all took the Black Sabbath sound and made it heavier and more darker. And this album from Candlemass showed that. Alright, number 68, which came out in 1981, High and Dry by Def Leppard. Def Leppard has always been one of my favorite bands because they were one of the best pop metal bands to ever come out in music, period. Because their music was always catchy, but had heaviness to it. And just good kind of beer drinking, get drunk partying kind of metal. Or hard rock, whatever. High and Dry was great. Number 67, which came out in 1984, Fistful of Metal by Anthrax. The first Anthrax album, the only one to feature Neil Turbin on vocals and Dan Lilker on bass. This is a highly underappreciated album from some people. This got the ball going for Anthrax. Hell, it was because of this album how they were managed to develop one of the heaviest reps in heavy metal. So there you go. Alright, number 66, which came out in 1987, the album Crossover by DRI. This was, along with Join the Army by Suicidal Tendencies, this was another album that developed the whole crossover movement for punk and for heavy metal. This album was different from their previous two albums that came out, the Dirty Rotten LP and the album dealing with it. This album was a bigger shift away from hardcore into more of a thrash sound. This album combined both sounds, as to on their next 4 albums to come out for DRI, they've shifted to being a strict thrash band. But this album was the beginning of all that, and this had some great tunes in it as well. And speaking of Suicidal Tendencies, number 65, which came out in 1983, the self-titled debut from Suicidal Tendencies. This album had no traces of crossover or thrash in general. This was more a strict hardcore punk album. If I had to pick my all-time favorite hardcore album, strict hardcore, not metalcore or whatever, but strict hardcore punk, this is the album that I go to if I want to listen to strictly hardcore. The album, the debut self-titled album from Suicidal, was amazing. And anybody who's a music fan should know the song Institutionalized. Alright, number 64, which came out in 1986, The Age of Quarrel by Cro-Mags. Some people out there would know who Cro-Mags are because it's one of CM Punk's favorite bands. But Cro-Mags, throughout their whole career, has always been another one of those progenitors of crossover. because they were big fans of hardcore and they really liked heavy metal. Then they decided to mix both sounds to make a crossover. This was one of those albums, again, actually I would consider this album to possibly be the first crossover album in a way, because it came out a year before Crossover from DRI and Join the Army from Suicidal. This came out in '86. It had some punk lyrics, but heavy metal riffs, great drumming, bass. Cro-Mags, I think, is probably one of the most underrated bands in rock music in general, because they had some great tunes, and their music got better as time went on, and their second album, which I'll get to later in the list, Best Wishes, proved it, and I'll get to that later. But anyways, and now we get to number 63, which came out in 1988, From Enslavement to Obliteration by Napalm Death. Napalm Death, the inventors of grindcore, and this album was, holy crap, fast, heavy, political, just amazing. Number 62, which came out in 1988 as well, we got Seventh Son of a Seventh Son by Iron Maiden. One of my all-time favorite bands, and this album was probably one of their best musicianship albums, because this album was more in the line of progressive metal, because they had long songs and very intricate songs. Alright, number 61, we've got Too Fast for Love by Motley Crue, which came out in 1981. The debut album from Motley Crue, a great album, heavy stuff, some fast songs like Live Wire. Great songs. Number 60, which came out in 1989, Piece of Time by Atheist. Atheist is another one of those highly underappreciated bands in rock and metal music, because these guys were one of the inventors of combining death metal, thrash metal, and progressive metal in order to create the whole technical progressive death metal movement. This song had a lot of technical death metal elements with the speed of thrash metal with some blast beats implemented. Very intricate, and great bass playing by the late great Roger Patterson, rest in peace. Just amazing album for anybody who likes to hear intricate rock or metal music. This is an album for that. Number 59, which is an album which came out in 1989, Beneath the Remains by Sepultura. This album is one of my favorites from Sepultura, along with Arise, which came out in 1991. But Beneath the Remains is an all-time thrash metal classic. You got great songs such as Beneath the Remains, Inner Self, Stronger Than Hate, Slaves of Pain, Mass Hypnosis, bunch of other good ones. Number 58, which is an album that came out in 1984, Love at First Sting by The Scorpions. One of those all-time bands to listen to for rock metal music. And it's a shame I think they're probably retired now, but if not, they're eventually retiring. But they've been around since 1965 and have kept rock music going strong all those years. And this album, most people would know this album for the song Rock You Like a Hurricane. Well, you got other good ones such as Still Loving You and a bunch of other good ones. Number 57, which came out in 1988, Leprosy by Death. A groundbreaking release for the death metal genre. And this was carried over from their debut album, which I'll get to later, Scream Bloody Gore. Except this one was more technical and more intricate. Number 56, which came out in 1989, Agent Orange by Sodom. Very barbaric and brutal thrash metal. I mean, the vocals were just absolutely oppressive. The playing on this album was great. Just amazing. Alright, number 55, which came out in 1988, How Will I Laugh Tomorrow by Suicidal Tendencies. Another one of those key releases in crossover, because this album, they went way more into the thrash metal world. When you got songs like Trip at the Brain, it just sets it over the top for how fast they can play. and how heavy they can be. Alright, number 54, which came out in 1987, Taking Over by Overkill. You want to talk about underrated and underappreciated? Overkill is so criminally underappreciated. Taking Over was a great album with classics such as Denied a Cross, Fear His Name, and In Union We Stand. Great, great songs. Number 53, which came out in 1981, Welcome to Hell by Venom. Venom was probably the first extreme metal band to ever come out. I mean, Black Sabbath were extreme for their time, but Venom was the band that said, fuck you, melody, we don't want it in metal in our music. We're just going to go straightforward, fast, heavy, brutal. And this album, along with their next album, which I'll talk about later, the song of the album Black Metal, influenced thrash, speed metal, death metal, black metal, any kind of extreme metal in general. Number 52, which came out in 1982, Blackout by the Scorpions. Wow. Talk about a great album by the Scorps. Blackout was amazing. Alright, number 51, which came out in 1980, British Steel by Judas Priest. Classic album by Priest, however, I don't think it's their best album, but British Steel is known for the songs Breaking the Law and Living After Midnight. But you got other good ones such as Metal Gods and The Rage. Just some great stuff. Now we're at the halfway point. Number 50. Holy crap, 26 minutes in and we're halfway through. This album came out in 1985, Speak English or Die by S.O.D. I actually kind of take back what I said about Cro-Mag's Age of Coral at that being the first crossover album. This album was the first crossover album because S.O.D. was a band that loved metal and hardcore and mixed it together. Very heavy, fast, short songs. Very goofy lyrical content, but controversial as well. Scott Ian and Charlie from Anthrax and Dan Lilker, who used to be in Anthrax, but he's in bands like Brutal Truth and Nuclear Assault. And their singer Billy Milano totally went over the top with this album. This album is an all-time metal classic. Alright. Number 49, which came out in 1989, Slowly We Rot by Obituary. The first album Obituary came out with, and it was very brutal, very gory. You want to hear some gory style death metal that's not Cannibal Corpse or Carcass? Obituary is that band. Number 48, which came out in 1989 again, this was The Years of Decay by Overkill. I'd say this is the best Overkill album. Great songs like Elimination, Time to Kill, Evil Never Dies, Who Tends the Fire, and the title track, Years of Decay. All classics. Number 47, which came out in 1989 again, Best Wishes by the Cro-Mags. Now, the Cro-Mags on this album, they didn't have their singer John Joseph, so Harley Flanagan, the bass player, took over the singing. And this album moved away from the hardcore crossover sound from Age of Quarrel to a thrash sound on this album, and I love this album. The best Cro-Mags album, I say, and this was about the same length as Age of Quarrel at 33 minutes, but this had only 8 songs, whereas on Age of Quarrel it was 15. So yeah. Number 46, which came out in 1989, Thrash Zone by DRI. The best DRI album ever, the heaviest, the fastest. Great, great, great stuff. Number 45, which came out in 1987, Into the Pandemonium by Celtic Frost. This was different from their first two albums, Morbid Tales and To Megatherion. This was an experimental album where they experimented with thrash metal and gothic metal, industrial kind of stuff. So that's why this album is an experimental metal album, or avant-garde metal. And this album invented experimental metal. Number 44, which came out in 1988, Blood, Fire, Death by Bathory. Bathory was the supposed inventor of black metal, but this album kind of moved away from black metal with the satanic lyrics and gore and crazy stuff. This was a first example of Viking metal, where they mostly sang about Norse mythology, like Thor, Loki, Odin, so on and so forth. It's like if you want to hear some music that goes along with the Thor movies or Viking movies, Bathory, this album, and the next album, which came out in 1990, Hammerheart, are the two albums that would be perfect to listen to while you watch those movies. Number 43, which came out in 1988, South of Heaven by Slayer. This was when Slayer transitioned from being mega fast to slowing things down, but still have the brutality intact. And South of Heaven definitely showed that. A little underrated, but it was still a great album. Number 42, which came out in 1988, Operation Mindcrime by Queensryche. One of the greatest concept albums and one of the greatest progressive metal albums of all time. Excuse me. Number 41, which came out in 1980, Iron Maiden's self-titled debut. Classic stuff. Really, without Iron Maiden, who knows where heavy metal would be today? Because Iron Maiden has been a band, along with Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Metallica, and Motorhead, even Venom and Slayer and Megadeth, and even Pantera, Death, and Bathory. Those are the bands and Napalm Death, who progened heavy metal into a lot of different musical horizons. But with this album by Iron Maiden, influenced a lot of different metal. Number 40, Pleasure to Kill by Kreator, which came out in 1986. Very aggressive thrash metal from Germany. Kreator is the Metallica as far as big and sound of Germany for German thrash, because these guys are so popular in the metal scene. They got heavy songs, fast songs, amazing. And this album was a classic in that sound. Alright, number 39, which came out in 1985, Celtic Frost's To Megatherion. This album was a continuation of Morbid Tales, of pretty extreme thrash with gruff vocals, not necessarily in the black metal or death metal sense, but gruff vocals with a thrash sound with some dark lyrics, not satanic lyrics, just dark lyrics. I hate it when people say that Celtic Frost was a black metal band, because I didn't hear any kind of elements of black metal with their music at all. To me, my musical ears, their 80s stuff was, minus the album Cold Lake, which sucked. Their first three albums were thrash or just experimental, in my personal opinion. Number 38, which came out in 1985, we've got Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good by Megadeth. The first Megadeth album, their fastest album and arguably heaviest, but I say Rust in Peace is their heaviest, but this album was definitely their fastest. Great songs, loved it. Number 37, which came out in 1985, Bonded by Blood by Exodus. All-time thrash classic. Great songs, crazy songs as well, and crazy subjects. And rest in peace, Paul Bailoff, the original singer. That was an amazing album. Number 36, which came out in 1985, Spreading the Disease by Anthrax. The second album to ever come out from Anthrax, the first to feature Joey Belladonna on vocals and Frankie Bello on bass. And this, musicianship and production-wise, was a huge improvement from Fistful of Metal. And the fact Joey Belladonna's voice sounds a lot like Steve Perry from Journey, and it's singing over this fast, heavy metal, thrash metal, went hand in hand. Fit the sounds perfectly. Number 35, which came out in 1987, Hysteria by Def Leppard. Their most popular album as far as popularity goes, because you got the song Pour Some Sugar on Me and the song Love Bites, which are two great songs. you know. But I thought this was a really good, thought this was a great album. I loved it. Classic stuff. Number 34, which came out in 1980, Lightning to the Nations by Diamond Head. Diamond Head is one of those very underrated bands. Without Diamond Head, who knows if there would be a Metallica or a Megadeth, because Diamond Head was a huge influence on both of those bands. Alright, what's next? Number 33, which came out in 1983, Peace of Mind by Iron Maiden. Great album with great songs such as The Trooper and Flight of Icarus and Were Eagles There and Revelations. Great stuff. Number 32, which came out in 1982, Metal on Metal by Anvil. Love that album. Sadly, I only got to know of Anvil from the movie, and good thing I did because I discovered their music. And talk about underrated. Anvil's underrated because these guys were like the spiritual forefathers of the speed metal, thrash metal movement, because this album was like the most intense heavy metal album before the dawn of thrash metal. Number 31, which came out in 1989, Altars of Madness by Morbid Angel. A huge key release for death metal music. Evil, satanic, brutal. The drumming from Pete Sandoval on this album blew my mind. The guitars, the bass, the vocals, great. Altars of Madness is one of the most important heavy metal albums of the 80s because it progened evil death metal music. Alright, number 30, which came out in 1985, Hell Awaits by Slayer, my favorite Slayer album, probably arguably the most brutal Slayer album, because this was their most evil sounding album. Because the band was listening to some Merciful Fate and Venom, and they took the lyrics from what they did, mixed in some technical elements of Merciful Fate, but with the heaviness and the speed of what they were doing, and produced their heaviest album they ever made. Number 29, which came out in 1984, Morbid Tales by Celtic Frost. Like I talked about with Celtic Frost, I think it's ridiculous that they get labeled as death metal or black metal when they're really like a thrash band or experimental. And this album blew my mind. And this was a little bit after Apocalyptic Raids came out from Hellhammer. So, relatively in 2 years, the same band produced 2 albums. Though it was different names, different sounds, and different lyrics, different everything. Hellhammer was a band that was meant to be very radical, very brutal, and very scary, lyric-wise, because it was very evil, satanic stuff like Venom. But Celtic Frost, it was completely different from that. Better musicianship, better playing than from Hellhammer, and just better music overall. Alright, number 28, which came out in 1987, The Legacy by Testament. The best Testament album, one of the greatest thrash albums of all time. Love this album. I love how fast it was, how heavy it was, how technical it was. Loved the sound of it. It was great. Number 27, which came out in 1985, Seven Churches by Possessed. This was a key release into the development of death metal, even though I don't really consider this to be death metal. It was a big influence on it, don't get me wrong, but I don't really personally classify Possessed as a death metal band. Even though they want to say they are, to my ears, they really weren't. They were a big influence on them, but I don't think they were strictly death metal. But this album was amazing. 10 songs, heavy, evil stuff. Took what Slayer and Venom were doing, mixed it together, and just went more over the top than what Venom was doing. Kind of in the same realm as what Slayer did on Hell Awaits, but this album was just like, holy shit. Number 26, which came out in 1981, Diary of a Madman by Ozzy Osbourne's solo band. The second album to feature Randy Rhoads, and this was a great album, classic stuff. Loved it. Number 25, Pyromania by Def Leppard, which came out in 1983. In my opinion, Def Leppard's best album, and it's got great songs like Rock of Ages and Rock Rock Till You Drop. And sorry about that, my headset came off. My ears are kind of hurting from wearing these, but yeah. Alright, number 24, which came out in 1987, Scum by Napalm Death. The first grindcore album to come out. Very fast, brutal, heavy, crazy songs. And this album holds the Guinness World Record for the world's shortest song, called You Suffer, which is like 1 second long. Holy crap. But every other song on this album was great. I love the song Siege of Power, which was the longest song on the album at like 4 minutes. So yeah. Short songs, but they were all awesome, heavy, brutal, fast. Just great. Alright, number 23. Anyways, number 23, which came out in 1988, And Justice for All by Metallica. Finally, we get to some Metallica on this list. But, And Justice for All, production-wise, was a okay production album. The bass, you couldn't really hear the bass, but there was reasons for that. But musicianship-wise, probably their most intricate album they ever made, because this album combined thrash with progressive metal. Because they had very technical, intricate stuff on this album, and I loved this album for that. You got one of their all-time classic songs, One, and other good ones. So, yeah. Alright, number 22, which came out in 1989, Dr. Feelgood by Motley Crue. Probably the band's most popular album, because it's got 2 of their most popular songs, Dr. Feelgood and Kickstart My Heart. Rightfully so. But this album I thought was great, so there you go. Number 21, which came out in 1987, Scream Bloody Gore by Death. The first true death metal album, and it inspired the whole genre. It invented the whole genre of death metal. Even though Possessed coined the term death metal with the song Death Metal on Seven Churches, this album was the first true death metal album, in my opinion. This invented death metal. Without death metal would not exist. And rest in peace, Chuck Schuldiner, for all the great music you put out in your short career from '87, from this album until 2001, when he passed away. I wish he was still alive today, and I wish Death was still around, because I'd say if they were still around, they'd be one of the biggest bands in heavy metal right now. Just my opinion. Alright, number 20, which came out in 1982, Black Metal from Venom. Even though I don't think Venom's really a black metal band, I think they were just an extreme thrash, or extreme speed metal band. They just had some crazy over-the-top lyrics and stuff. But this album was what coined the term black metal, but it wasn't a true black metal album. Venom, I never really considered them black metal at all. Like I said, I consider them an extreme speed metal band that just influenced extreme metal music in general. Number 19, which came out in 1983, Shout at the Devil by Motley Crue. In my opinion, the best Motley Crue album, their heaviest album, and just great. Alright. Number 18, which came out in 1981, Killers by Iron Maiden. A huge musicianship and production improvement from the first album, which came out in 1980. And this was only the last album to feature Paul Di'Anno, original vocalist, on their albums. As to, on the next album that came out, they had Bruce Dickinson. But, yeah. Number 17, Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses, which came out in 1987. I think Guns N' Roses is a little bit of an overrated band, but I can't deny their music was great for their time. But this album was definitely amazing. Great songs, like Welcome to the Jungle and stuff. Awesome. Number 16, which came out in 1984, Power Slave by Iron Maiden. Probably my personal favorite Iron Maiden album, but I don't think it was their best album, but it's my personal favorite. Because you got the classic songs like Aces High, 2 Minutes to Midnight, Power Slave, and Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Great stuff. Number 15, which came out in 1983, Holy Diver by Dio. Rest in peace, Dio, and this album was a classic. That's all I've got to say about that. Number 14, which came out in 1984, Don't Break the Oath by Merciful Fate. Merciful Fate is one of the all-time bands in heavy metal because these guys influenced so many people, so many bands, and just great songs. Controversial lyrical content because of the whole devil thing, the satanic imagery King Diamond did, but not in a black metal sense. This was like a real traditional heavy metal album. It combined Iron Maiden with progressive elements and evil lyrics, and it worked. This album blew my mind. Great songs. King Diamond, the most unique heavy metal vocalist of all time. Love this album. Highly check it out. Number 13, which came out in 1983, Kill 'Em All by Metallica. The first Metallica album, and in my opinion, the first true thrash album. And Kill 'Em All, phenomenal. Number 12, which came out in 1980, we've got Ace of Spades by Motorhead. Most people would know this album for the song Ace of Spades, but you got other good songs like We Are the Road Crew and Jailbait. Great songs. Number 11, which came out in 1987, Among the Living by Anthrax. I already posted a review on this album. Check it out if you want to see the review, but I said this album was phenomenal. Great songs. Loved it. Now we're finally in the top 10. 45 minutes in. Oh my god, I'm so tired from talking a lot. But we're at the top 10 and we're almost done. Alright, number 10, which came out in 1984, the album 1984 by Van Halen. Arguably their second best album behind Van Halen 1, which came out in 78. But 1984 had some great songs like Jump, Hot for Teacher, Panama, and just other good ones. Number 9, which came out in 1982, Screaming for Vengeance by Judas Priest. Their best album from the 80s, but their second best album in my opinion. Most people know this album for the songs You Got Another Thing Coming and Electric Eye, but you got other good ones like the song Hellion and the title track Screaming for Vengeance and Devil's Child. Great songs. Alright, number 8, which came out in 1980, Heaven and Hell by Black Sabbath. This is the first Sabbath album without Ozzy and to feature Ronnie James Dio, and boy did the band change their sound completely. It was heavier, more intricate in a way, and just epic vocals. Love this album. Rest in peace, Dio. Black Sabbath will live on, too. Number 7, which came out in 1980, is Blizzard of Oz by Ozzy Osbourne's solo band. In my opinion, the best album Ozzy ever did as a solo artist. The first album with Randy Rhoads. Great songs like Crazy Train, Mr. Crowley, and other good ones. Phenomenal. Number 6, which came out in 1984, Ride the Lightning by Metallica. I've already reviewed this, you know how I felt. This album is phenomenal. There you go. Number 5, we're in the top 5 finally. 1986, Peace Sells But Who's Buying by Megadeth. Holy crap. Some people can argue this is probably Megadeth's best album. I say it's a close second to Rust in Peace, but Peace Sells blew my mind when I first heard it. Great thrash metal. Awesome. Number 4, which came out in 1982, Number of the Beast by Iron Maiden. The best Iron Maiden album, the most classic. First album with Bruce Dickinson on vocals. Great job. You got the classics, Number of the Beast, Run to the Hills, Ah, Hallowed Be Thy Name. Other underrated ones like The Prisoner and Invaders. Great songs. Number 3, which came out in 1986, Rain and Blood by Slayer. One of the greatest thrash albums and heavy metal albums of all time. Brutal, fast, heavy. Amazing. Number 2, which came out in 1980, Back in Black by AC/DC. Phenomenal album, and this is the first album to feature Brian Johnson on vocals. Anybody who likes music knows who AC/DC is and loves them. One of my all-time favorites. Love it. Number 1, 1986, Master of Puppets by Metallica. The greatest heavy metal album of all time, in my opinion. The best Metallica album. And without this album, heavy metal would not be as popular as it is today. No question. Master of Puppets just put thrash metal on the mainstream map. And you already seen my review on it. You know how I love this album. There you go. And anyways, that finally does it. 50 minutes strong. Top 100 hard rock heavy metal albums of the 80s. Next video I'm going to do about this will be the top 50 albums of the 90s. Until then, peace.